So one of the things I realized talking to my neighbors is that this prosperity gospel that's running wild in South America and in Africa, it's live here on our streets too. And in places like this, the prosperity gospel really sounds like good news. Whether you drive from here to one of the mega churches where people are preaching it and practicing it, or whether you turn on your TV and see one of the folks with bright shining smiles telling you that God wants your best life now. This idea that that God wants to make you rich is appealing to people who've kind of been kicked to the curb for so long, and who've been told that the good news is there for you and the sweet by and by, and what you need to do is just hold on to God's unchanging hand and continue suffering, and maybe sustain yourself on your welfare check, unless we get the government to cut that too. And I think what I want to say to the prosperity gospel is that it's partly right. The reason it's so appealing to neighbors here is because it's saying God has something to offer you in the here and now. And I think people who know Jesus and who read the stories about Jesus and who read the stories about the God of Israel, who brought him up out of Egypt and through the Red Sea and got him out from under Pharaoh's grip, they know that this God is somebody who wants to change the real material circumstances of our lives in the here and now. And yet it's such a tragedy to see the kind of content of the gospel turned into the American dream rather than the good news of God's abundance that Jesus tries to communicate in the Gospels. And so these tactics of Jesus for a good life in the here and now, I think is a real alternative to this health and wealth gospel that gets so many people excited, but I think ultimately leaves us disappointed, because even though the preacher's driving the Rolls Royce, most of us aren't going to get to. And as a matter of fact, the poor widows keep throwing their mites into the coffers to keep the pastor in his Rolls Royce, while at the same time they're not able to pay their bills. And what Jesus offers us is this incredible opportunity to step into the abundance of God, the God who created everything and who insists that there's always enough. And yet the only way to enter into this economy is to take what we have, even the little that we have, to break it and to share it with neighbors. It's like that story that's told in all the Gospels of Jesus after he'd been teaching folks all day. Folks like our neighbors here who've had a rough run of it and suffered all the isms and had their backs against the wall, and they've come to Jesus because Jesus is preaching good news of healing and restoration, and that Jesus has been preaching all day, and the disciples come to him and say, hey, you got to send these people home, they don't have anything to eat, and Jesus says, well, why don't you feed them? And the disciples kind of look at each other and say, we'd have to work 6 months, get enough money to feed all these people, and besides, there's no Walmart to buy food at. And Jesus says, what do you have? And they pull out this little sack lunch that a kid was willing to show. And, there's a little bread and some fish, and Jesus says, give it to me. And he takes it, and the Gospels say he breaks it, and he blesses it, and he hands it back to them and says, distribute it to these folks. And in little groups, here and there, scattered on the grass, right at the ground level, people start eating, and this miracle happens, this miracle of multiplication and abundance. And Jesus sends the disciples back around and says, gather up the leftovers. And so they come back, and every one of the disciples has a basket full of leftovers. And it's almost like Jesus is looking at them and saying, you see, there's enough for all of them and more than enough for you to have leftovers if we're willing to break what we have. And I think that's the good news of God's economy. Not that God wants to make you rich, not that you're going to get to drive around in a Rolls Royce if you'll just give everything, give your whole self over to Jesus, but rather that the good news is that if you take what you have, however little it is, break it and bless it, and share it, that there's enough for everybody, and that weaves us into a new kind of community, a community where like Paul says, whoever has too much, whoever gathers much doesn't have too much, and whoever gathers little doesn't have too little, because there's enough for everybody. I think that's the good news of manna, the good news of God's abundance in this new economy.
I mean, it just sounds silly. I mean, how can that actually work here now?
Well, I think about that hillside, and those people who were really hungry, that's grassroots. They're sitting there on the grass in the here and now. It's not a promise for that great beautiful green field where the lion will lay down with the lamb one day. Of course, we hope for that, and there is an end to this story. But the incredible thing about the gospel, the incredible thing about Jesus, is that the end has interrupted us in the middle, and we've had. Jesus is the fulfillment of all things. Jesus is the New Jerusalem, all wrapped up in one person. And here he walked among us, and here he goes all the way to the cross to show us what God's love looks like. And here he is on Easter morning, out of the tomb, unbound, at large in the world, and we're not quite sure where we're going to find him, and he's going ahead of us into Galilee, so we can't claim, that he's right here and we can control him. But lo and behold, for the rest of the New Testament, there's this conviction that the Spirit of God has descended on this people called church and made us into that body. And so the end that interrupts us in the middle is the church. And however messy it is, however hard a time we have figuring out what it means to be church, what it means to live out and participate in this new economy, we know it's possible because Jesus is risen and the Spirit's at large, and we can participate in it where we are.